still on the Santa Rosa Symphony Board, where he's been for 3 years. We keep him very busy at ACSO, so I will not be giving you his contact information, lest you want to poach him for your own board. Some housekeeping for the webinar. Everyone is on mute now. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it in the area you see to the right of your screen. We'll read the answer and question at the end of the webinar as time permits. Okay, Alan, let's get started. All right, we've just changed the screen over.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to make sure, 1 second, I'm going to make sure that the screen is available. Looks like it should be. Hopefully you can see the splash screen of the presentation. If you're having any trouble with audio or visual during the presentation, just type something in chat and we'll try to make an adjustment. Well, Chris, the topic of board membership is vital to nonprofits, as we all know, and the question really is a life or death question for nonprofits.
Why governance matters.
Yes, so as you see in this quote from a former Lincoln Center president, trustee involvement can mean life or death for a nonprofit. And so this question of how to recruit, retain talent on the board, and the right governance structures for managing the nonprofit is really critical to the entire endeavor. What I want to share with you today is some work that was published by Stanford. It was a study that was done in 2014, and it involved Stanford's corporate governance function, BoardSource, which is obviously the leader in nonprofit board thought leadership, and GuideStar, which is the largest global survey information on nonprofits. And basically it was a survey of 924 nonprofits about 3 themes that we're going to talk about today in terms of best practices: composition of the board, structure of the board, and board practices. And the authors represent some of the key skills and insights that are required for a good board. So Bill Meehan, many of you may know, he's an ex-McKinsey person. He's an expert on nonprofit strategy and governance. He's a trustee of the San Francisco Symphony. Larker is more the accounting and finance side. Donatiello is somebody who's focused on media and tech, and he's also involved in grant making and funding. And then Brian Tayan is corporate governance research. So it's an interesting study, and it has a lot of implications for arts, nonprofit organizations, and boards. Before I move into some of the survey results, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the group of nonprofits that were interviewed. So that sort of some demographic information about the 924 organizations. 11% of them were arts nonprofits, so a substantial number were not arts nonprofits. As you would expect, there were a couple of other categories that were a little bit larger. 25% were educational nonprofits, and 16% were either social or legal. But the arts category was the 3rd largest in this survey, so definitely a representative segment. The median nonprofit, the sort of historical period for the median nonprofit in this survey was 25 years, so many in the survey have been around for a long time. And I thought, just because ACSO reaches organizations of so many different budget sizes, I thought I would also tell you about that in this survey. So 15% of the respondents are organizations that have a budget of less than $500,000, 25% $500,000 to $5 million, and 50% greater than $5 million. And the last fact I'll share with you is number of directors, the median number of directors. So for the small budget size, it was median of 9 directors. The medium budget size was 12, and the large budget size, greater than 5 million, was board size of 18. All right, so that's it for numbers on the background. Let's get into what did they find when they did this survey. So the first couple of points are that, almost a quarter of board members don't think their colleagues have a strong understanding of the organization's mission and strategy. And the second point is that 2/3 don't think that their board is extremely experienced in doing nonprofit governance. And to me, the most disturbing part of that, and it's the second part of statement number 2, is about 50% don't think that their colleagues are very engaged in their work. So if you think about observation number 1 and 2, the theme there is too many directors lack a deep understanding of the organization, or they don't have enough background, or they don't understand their obligations. So that's sort of observation number 1. Observation number 2 is kind of groups points 3, 4, and 5 on page 4. So there you see things about performance data, so reviewing the outcomes and some metrics around the organization. Almost half have no confidence that they're reviewing the right things to understand whether their organization is a success. Almost a third don't think that their board can evaluate how well the organization's doing, and 42% don't have an audit committee and don't have a robust way of looking at financial performance. So I would say points 3, 4, and 5 really point to structure and process. Organizations may be missing some key committees or functions, or they may be missing goal setting and review of goals.
Alan, and
yes.
Further to that, we always recommend the board do an annual board evaluation. So they're evaluating themselves. Board Source is a great resource for you. They have these evaluations that you can pay for. We've used them here on our board, and it's really a way of finding out. You think your board knows everything. They're on the board after all. But when they take this evaluation, you can then, your executive committee, your president can then respond to the weaknesses on the board. So I highly recommend that everyone do a board evaluation annually.
Well, and that's a perfect segue to the second set of observations from the survey, because at the end of the day, so I'll start with item 10 and 11, which is boards have a very high opinion of how well the executive director's doing and how well the organization's doing. So very optimistic and positive about their organization. And yet, the disconnect is, look at item 6. 57% don't look at their performance against peer groups. I'll just mention one of the benefits of ACSO is, when we get together at conference or we do small gatherings of people, we get people in similar budget sizes together to share stories and concerns, and we also have data about compensation and other kinds of things, and that's a way of kind of getting peer information out in the universe for people to use as a means of understanding how their organization's doing against organizations of similar size and budget. But 57% don't do that kind of work. 39% don't have any kind of robust metrics for measuring the outcomes of the executive director. And then there's and although people are very happy with executive directors, look at number 9, almost all directors surveyed believe that the executive director understands the mission well. There's also a personnel sort of gap, because look at number 8. 78% couldn't name a successor if the current executive were to leave. Now, I know some organizations of smaller size don't have an executive director, but you can just insert board president or key leader of the board in that slot, and a vast majority of organizations don't have a clear successor in mind should somebody have to leave or be removed in an emergency. So the highlight on this page from my point of view is, despite the comfort that many directors have with their organization and its place in the world, and despite their comfort with the leader of their board or the leader of their staff, we could do better on reviewing executive directors in a more formal way. We could do better at evaluating, as Chris just said, the board should be evaluating itself against the initiatives that it's promoted. And those are areas where we really could do better in closing the gap here. I'll just give you one statistic that's not on the page. 36% of nonprofit directors never evaluate themselves. So that's a pretty high number of boards that never do any kind of self-reflection on how are they doing against initiatives that they set for the organization. Okay, so those are key highlights. We'll be happy to send you the full study so you can see every question and answer. But I think, Chris, do you want to interject anything there, or should we start moving on to our suggestions for this group?
Well, when I read 6 through 11, of course, I was very pleased with number 9, that all directors think, as an executive director, all board members think that we understand the mission well. So that was the highlight, but of course, reading on, yes, there needs to be a lot more work done. So let's go on to the recommendations.
Okay, so we have 9 recommendations for you to consider. And I think from this point forward, if you have a question you want to ask, we're very happy. You can just put it in online and we can try to answer it as we move along. But in the absence of that, we'll just keep going through these 9 recommendations and some stories and thoughts about them. Obviously, the first thing in any nonprofit, think of it as the foundation for governance, is having a mission that's focused and that you've aligned the skills and resources with that mission. Because if the mission of the organization is too vague or too unattainable, like, think of a healthcare organization that's, saying something like they want to end world hunger, that's not achievable, and so it has to be narrow and focused and tied to the community and the scope of services that you offer. And having that be clearly understood and articulated and up to date. A lot of organizations have one that used to be true and things have changed and they haven't updated it, but it's an underpinning for like who you need on the board, how you set priorities, and how you measure success. So focused, clear mission is the number one thing.
And I would also say that make sure all of your staff understand the mission, and that would include your music director. We did a consultation a few years ago. It was a governance board roles and responsibilities event, and we put the mission statement up on the screen, and the music director became apoplectic when he realized that the mission was to perform certain repertoire that he hadn't been doing, and he became very upset about it, and it led to an interesting discussion. But all of your stakeholders need to know what this mission is of your organization.
And that's a perfect segue to actually the hang on a second. For some reason, it's not advancing. Oh, there we go. That's a great segue to page 7, which is making sure that it's understood by everyone, right? So as Chris said, every staff person, music director, board, I mean, it goes beyond the internal organization. You know, your funders need to understand the mission. It needs to be connected to your community. And I think that that's another really critical piece of this. Okay, so assuming that your mission and statement is up to date and that there's been a lot of clarity of communication among different constituents and stakeholders, then you really get into the third recommendation, which is having clear roles for the executive director and the board and strategies and goals around that. So, you know, from our way of thinking, sort of there's the philosophical piece of this, which is, you know, the ED's task is to develop goals and strategies that will make meaningful progress toward the organization's mission. And the board's there as a sounding board, right, to think about the theory of change, the logic, the business model, but there needs to be real clarity about who owns action and management and who is there from a consulting and advisory point of view, and keeping those roles and responsibilities clear. And I know that I'll give you an example from Santa Rosa Symphony. You know, the board and staff collaborated together on a renewed strategic plan. We've done the same thing at ACSO. And one of the things that's really important there is thinking about the strategies. Staff has to say what's doable and actionable within a given time frame, and the method of getting that done and executing it, and who's going to be assigned to it. But both the board and staff have to think about putting metrics together tied to something like a strategic plan, and how will you measure whether something's successful or not. Things like audience development. Are you trying to develop a new segment of the audience? Are you trying to improve some quality of budget outcome? Are you trying to improve the diversity and skill set on the board? Whatever the strategic initiatives are, is it clear who's driving what, and who's in the advisor role and who's in the execution role, is sort of the heart of this. Chris, anything you wanted to chime in on that one about?
No, you said that perfectly. Thank you.
And that leads into performance metrics. And remember, this is one of the gaps that the study points out. I love this Einstein quote, which Meehan repeats in this study, but not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. But I will tell you, organizations, this is true in for-profit and not-for-profit, what we measure and count ends up getting attention, and it ends up getting resource. And so, like making sure that the things that are critical to your mission, and especially critical to the future of your organization, that you think of a way to measure that. And I think about orchestras, and I think about, okay, so I just gave you an example a moment ago, but it could be like the audience question, which is we constantly talk about developing new audiences, and we need to be very specific about what that means and how you would measure progress toward that. Or it could be that an organization's struggling on budget, and you set a reasonable series of actions to get you to from a troubled financial spot to a healthier financial spot. And that could be measured in any number of ways. It could be things like board giving and philanthropy, and like what percentage of revenue the board's giving. It could be things like scope of services for educational programs. How many music in the schools programs are we executing? How many students are we reaching? You know, et cetera, et cetera. Chris, anything on performance metrics that you wanted to chime in on?
Yes. You know, when I have conversations with members, very often it starts off by, how's it going? Oh, everything is wonderful. Oh, this performance was so terrific. And those are wonderful, wonderful ways to start a conversation. But then when you get into asking the questions and the metrics come up, there are gaps. And I think a lot of organizations don't, as Ellen said, they're not measuring what they should be measuring. An annual audience survey or every other year audience survey is a really good way to understand who your audience is. And I mean, you can have very, very you can have a lot of fun with questions. You know, the hard things, you know what the scope of how many seats you sell, how your subscriptions are doing. Typically marketing is measured very well, and development, obviously. Alan mentioned board giving as a percentage of contributed income. It's so important that every board member give you know, the largest gift they can make. But just measuring it is important. It's a different kind of a picture than the feeling that you come away with after, you know, a good performance. This is as important as, you know, that Beethoven piece making you feel terrific. So we strongly suggest you do this annually.
And I agree completely, Chris. I mean, because we all get excited and passionate about the musical performances, and that's super important. But it's not. I mean, from a governance point of view, we just have to look at some things that are measurable and see if we're making progress, and that the organization's healthy. It's like it's the fiduciary responsibility of the board to ask those tough questions and measure things. And that leads into managing the team that's working here. Now, again, I recognize that not everyone on the call has staff. Some organizations are really run by the board, and others have a very large staff. So there's a broad range of things here. But the important thing here is that with any human organization, regardless of whether it's 100% volunteer or a mix of board and staff, the leadership has to be reviewed against the goals of the organization. So, you know, are the goals of the mission being achieved? If there's a strategic plan and there are metrics around the strategic plan, are those things being achieved? And that really should go into the evaluation. You know, best practice is definitely at least annual review, and there should be objective feedback as part of that. And, you know, it gets into things like compensation. You know, compensation is a hot topic in nonprofits. If you're not doing an annual review for your executive director, you're not on very solid ground around compensation conversations. And then the other thing is succession planning. So important for leadership of the board and for leadership of staff. And you heard the statistic earlier, very few boards are prepared for, you know, the unwelcome sort of like immediate departure of a leader. And this is why personnel committees or a subset of the board focused on personnel matters is very important. Highly confidential. It needs to be consultative and based on facts, but it's very important to the health of the organization. And, you know, if an organization ever has to terminate an executive director, you know, it's absolutely critical from a litigation point of view to have followed the law and been very thorough about reviews. Chris,
Right.
anything on anything on that one?
Yeah, as we've mentioned before, so many of our members are without professional staff. So I guess in a way you could hold your president to the same kind of standards. They are the leader, they are the face of the organization. Similarly, your music director is in some cases the only staff. So it's important to, you know, it falls to the leadership of the board to make sure that that top person, whoever it is doing a good job for the organization.
You know, you spoke of music director, Chris, and it reminded me that we've had some really effective dialogue between the musicians in the Santa Rosa Symphony and the conductor. And it's just around feedback. It's not necessarily, it's just making sure that there's structured feedback so that it's not one way. I don't know that everyone does that, but I thought it was a useful thing and an important thing, because it's not part of the rehearsal structure. It's something that you have to make happen if you believe that it's important for leaders on the board, leaders of artistic side leaders of the staff to get feedback, you have to make it happen. It doesn't happen automatically.
Ellen, we had a question that is appropriate to answer right now, and it has to do whether staff should contribute to the review of an executive director. And, you know, your personnel policies should answer that question in as much as the board reviews, hires and fires the ED. The ED hires and fires his or her own staff. I think it's going to probably change from organization to organization. If you have staff that are unhappy with their executive director, there needs to be some process within your organization. It should be laid out in your personnel policies about the appropriate steps to take. I don't know of many organizations whereby the staff is asked by the board personnel committee to review the executive director. I mean, typically you hear about things when something's going wrong with the ED, but it should be reflected somehow in the personnel policies, I would say.
Got it. Makes sense. Excuse me. The next recommendation is absolutely critical. This is the heart of a governance committee, which is, I mean, the goal at the end of the day, I believe, is to have a small group of committed and cohesive leaders. So, I mean, you may have a large board, but you need a small group that is passionate, committed, and also cohesive, so they're aligned. They understand the mission, they know where you're going, they have each other's back, they operate as a team. I mean, that is a gold mine for a nonprofit. So how do you get there? Well, one of the ways you get there is a really thoughtful and strategic recruiting and vetting process. So you need to look at what skills are needed on your board, and so that could be background, it could be business, finance, marketing, artistic matters, people management, all those kinds of things. It could be what communities are you serving and are they represented on your board? And you sort of need to say, who do we have today? What are we missing that we need to be a fully diverse and inclusive board that is tied to our mission? And then start looking for people in a targeted way. And then the governance committee and the staff have to really work together to vet candidates, because you really need someone who wants to be on the board, is aligned with the mission, and has the ability and the time to dedicate to being on the board. And you know, that's a process that's worth doing thoughtfully and carefully, because it's like any hiring decision, you live with the consequences for a long time. So you want to be strategic and you want to vet carefully. Chris, do you want to chime in on the vetting part and the?
Yes, well, I'd first like to say that developing a matrix of needs should be your first step. So those of you on the board, you should have a file, a spreadsheet of skills that you need and the constituencies that are represented, as Alan mentioned before. So get that matrix first. I also recommend that everyone that you bring on the board should be presidential leadership material. You need to invest in these people. Trainings, being on ACSO webinars, coming to conferences. Local nonprofit organizations, foundations have ways to have classes and ways to train board members. It's just key. The vetting process also is just Chris's rule. Do not ever tell a prospect that there's nothing to do and it won't take you much time to be on this board. Not allowed to do that. So face-to-face meetings, reading bios, checking people out, and sometimes you don't have a good fit, and you move on. But it's so important. It's a way to show off your organization. It's a way to see that you're on the same page with your values, and what this person. And you should never be apologetic about coming on the board. This is important work, and you need to present it that way. I think, is that what you want to do on the vetting, Alan? Because I have a couple of other things. I think you're going into the expectations.
Yeah, and well, actually, and we got a question that Chris, which was, development nominating committee, is that mandatory or optional? What's your view on that, Chris?
Nominating committee, mandatory, optional. Yes, I serve on all of those committees. I don't know. I don't know why
we do.
The director wouldn't.
Yeah, on nominating, I mean, we do. Yeah.
I mean, I put forth people as well. Every one of us needs to make the case. So the case is what's important, not who's inviting somebody on or putting a name forth. It's how they're going to enhance the organization.
Every board that I've been on ED has been actively involved in development nomination process, but the vetting needs to be on both sides. There needs to be somebody on the trustee side and somebody on the staff side, ideally, who both reviewed the person and are comfortable. That's usually the best idea.
Yes, absolutely. It needs to be the input from both. I mean, here at ACSO, we have a very active, very strong governance nominating committee, and I may make an initial call to someone, but I let the board, the governance committee, take over after that.
So Chris, let me just segue to something you said that I thought was super important, because I think of, so in my for-profit job, I manage a big team, and there's the hiring and recruiting of talent, but there's the development of talent, and that's what Chris was talking about. Once somebody's on your board, so you believe you've hired a great person, there's the fit with the role. It needs to be the right fit for them at this moment. And because people's lives change, and the pressures that they're under at home and at work, and how they can serve on your board will change over time. So it's making sure that they have the right role at the right time. And as Chris correctly said, like, you've got a leadership path for most people on your board where you'd like them to go, and you're investing in them. And then I think the last thing that I would say is listening to them about the flexibility that they need, because not everybody has the same amount of time to be physically present for meetings, and it just depends on where they are in their life and their career, and you need to listen carefully about the flexibility and the accommodation that people need in order to get their full participation. And we'll come back to, in a couple of slides, we're going to talk about when it doesn't work out, because it doesn't always work out. But this is finding great people and how to keep them. One of the findings was that not everybody's engaged. I would say that that's probably because in many organizations there aren't enough conversations with people who are not engaged about, are they on the right committee? Are they in the right role? Are we asking them to use their skills in the right way? Those are critical questions if you want high engagement.
That is so important, Alan. It's so important. It's not enough to put somebody on a committee. You want somebody to own their work on the board.
And then the next bit, if you go to page 12, is when you do, and this is an ongoing thing, but it's especially critical when someone joins a board, being very clear in the vetting process, what are your expectations? What are your baseline expectations? Because you may have to come back to that if somebody's not fulfilling them. So there's a sort of onboarding, Orientation needs to be very clear. You need to talk them through the history, and we do like an hour orientation for everyone who joins ACSO: history, mission, financials, history of the conferences, et cetera, et cetera. People need board buddies. They need somebody that they can talk to about their experience on the board. They need clear committee assignments, and those kinds of things. But just
handbooks help. Handbooks, we have a wonderful
Yes.
handbook at ACSO, and I think some of the guts of that handbook are actually posted on our website. If you need ideas of what should be in a board handbook, let me know.
Perfect. And then the next page is we're at number 8 out of 9. The next is making sure that you have key committees, right? I mean, a lot of boards spend a lot of time on structure and process, but I mean, there's sort of 4 committees that almost every board needs. You need a governance committee, you need something on development, you need a finance committee. Most boards need an audit committee or something that covers a group that covers audit. You may need other committees, but our advice is make sure that if you're creating additional committees, make sure that if it's going to be an ongoing thing, that it's very important. Or alternatively, consider having special task forces for like strategic planning, for a capital campaign, music director search, those kinds of things. Those are more task forces. They aren't necessarily needed year in and year out. Obviously, an executive committee on large boards is critical because not everyone can be involved in detailed decision making that staff is going to need from a board on a large board. But that's more for a large board. Anything on committee structure, Chris, you wanted to say?
Well, I think it's a really good idea to define your committees, as Alan said. Maybe create the job description for the committee or a charter. I recommend, and we use at ACSO, a monthly calendar, so an annual calendar of all the tasks and deadlines that a committee is responsible for. We do, because we're statewide, we're not all in the same town as most of your board members from your organizations are. We do a lot of conference calling for our committee work. You could as well. You wouldn't have to meet in person. We find that way these meetings are very focused. We have an agenda, a timed agenda. We don't want to waste anyone's time. We want to get to the business. But I think it's one thing to say you have these committees. It's another thing to define what these committees are responsible for.
Absolutely. So we got a question, Chris, about people who are not performing as board members, and that leads perfectly into page 13 or recommendation 8.
Right.
I'm sorry, page 14. And our last recommendation, which is regularly review and assess each board member and the board's overall performance. So the question of non-performing trustees comes up, but let's talk about the whole system. I mean, I do think in any human organization, you're going to end up with people who are exhibiting tremendous leadership and passion and potential. And so those people you want to manage up. You want to prepare them through today's experiences and next year's experiences to have a bigger leadership role. And so, there's sort of the fast track to senior leader roles for some people. Some people are well suited to the role that they're in, and you want them to be on your board, and maybe you don't have term limits and you want them to be on your board for a very long time. We at ACSO, even though we have 3-year terms, but we have many people who continue on beyond one term. But there is that question of checking in on a regular basis about, is it still the right fit? Are you still on the right committee? Are you still engaged? Those questions, assumptions are dangerous, and it's very important not to have those conversations and dig deep. And then there are people who are not contributing, not attending, not aligned, and that's why a governance committee really has to manage them out. Now, the question that I got was, do you try to keep them in the organization? Absolutely. I mean, I think the best, and that's my view, unless they've done something illegal or destructive, which is a very special category, if they haven't done anything harmful to the organization, I would say, and they believed in your organization, I think you want to keep them in the family, but you do want to have an honest conversation with them about whether board service is the right fit for them given what's going on in their life. And there are respectful but direct ways to do that. And I think respect is the key. It's finding a very natural and direct way to ask an open-ended question and push. And, if you have to give some examples about non-attendance or non-participation or lack of following through on baseline board commitments, you have to be willing to bring those things up if the person is not self-aware. But I would say in most cases, if you open the door, people will tell you the truth about how it's going for them and whether they have time and passion for board service. And you should be, I think you should, in many cases, you should be able to shift them to volunteer or other roles. Chris, do you have a different view? Or
no, I don't have a different view, but the question, I would hope to not ever get that question, because moving to slides, at the beginning of the presentation, we talk about roles and responsibilities of a board. And if these, and the vetting process, and if all of that works well, you should, to say that someone is not board material, one wonders what went wrong in that process. But I will say that it is the entire board that must give the authority to the governance committee to make these calls, to make these observations. So if you have an individual that's not performing, as Alan said, in various ways, the committee, the chair of the committee, and or the president cannot be afraid of having this conversation. I mean, at the end of the day, this is not about any one person. It's about the entire organization. So if people aren't pulling their weight, it's an honest, respectful conversation. And as Alan said, you can bring up the fact that perhaps they're not attending enough meetings, they're not, whatever makes them not being good board material can be addressed in a respectful way. I don't ever recommend throwing someone out of the family. We need lots of different kinds of people. But a board is the governing arm of this organization, of the owners of this organization, and it's so critical that they be, on task, on mark. So that, I think, just to reiterate, the full board, in a discussion with the full board, they need to give the authority to the governance committee to do these reviews.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last thing on this page is evaluation of trustees. I mean, obviously, people come up for term limits. There should be a conversation about, within the governance committee and with the candidate individually, does this person still performing over time? Do we want this person to continue? And then there's the conversation with the individual. Is this still working for you, given where you are and the number of years that you've served on the board? And what needs to be different? What would need to change to make it even more effective? Just part of managing those relationships. And so in some cases it's being willing to have a courageous conversation, as Chris just mentioned. In other cases it is not assuming, being explicit, having regular conversations so that you know where people are and where their motivation and their energy is for the organization, and how best to harness that and really maximize the benefit of that passion for the organization and put them in the right place with the right role so that you can really get the maximum contribution of the full team. Well, that's it in terms of formal comments. I mean, we will, after this, Chris and I'll figure out the easiest way to send you guys a link to the full survey so you can have a look at all the questions. But I guess at this point, we just want to see if there are any other questions. Chris, is that right?
Right. I don't see anything coming up, but I just wanted to add that sometimes we need to remember to elevate our attitudes. At the end of the day, it's not about the individual personalities on the board, but it's about what we hope for our organizations and thinking about the Santa Cruz Symphony as opposed to somebody's, a difficult personality. So it's about the organization, and when we elevate the conversation that way, I think it goes much better, and it's clearer what the responsibilities are.
So Chris, there was one question about selling, suggestions on sort of selling a group of the value of metrics to an organization that's not so focused on the numbers. And then there's another question after that.
Yeah.
You have an immediate reaction to that? Sort of, it's making the case for metrics to an organization that's not really focused on that.
Well, I think the board, after this webinar, I think this absolutely is the reason that they should do it. I think they've got a lot of fuel here now to suggest that the value of the metrics.
Well, and not to overplay the dramatically negative, but without metrics, certain things, really bad things can happen, right, Chris?
Right, absolutely.
I mean,
we've got another question about recommendations for finding good board members. This is always a tough one, and I was sort of hoping no one would ask it. But I think sometimes you can look at your donors. I think you can look at your long-time audience subscribers. We've all heard the stories about someone passes away, or we got a large gift and we had no idea where this was coming from. It came out of the blue, and it just reminds me that sometimes we don't know enough about our audience members. But I think that would be a good way to look. Clearly, these people have been supporting your organization for a long time. Maybe it's just a conversation. Maybe they're there just waiting to be asked.
So two other questions, Chris. One was, is it ever appropriate for staff? These are related in my mind. So one question was, is it ever appropriate for staff to participate in the review of the ED? And then the other one was, what if the board president or the board committee reviewing the ED doesn't really know what's going on enough with operations in the day-to-day to effectively review? So I'll say two things. One is, and I don't see this done broadly in nonprofits, but I will tell you where I work, we do a lot of work on this. The best practices around feedback is that they need to be really the full circle, 360, and it needs to be anonymous. And so really teams that report to a manager should get to say what it's like working for that person. Peers should get a chance to say what it's like working with that person, and the person's manager should get a chance to say. That's the ideal kind of feedback loop. You'd have to adapt it to the size and scale of your organization. But I do think that staff input should, a board president who's doing a thorough review of an executive director has to find a way to get some feedback from staff about how it is to work for the executive director. The other thing I would say is, on the other question, does the board know enough about the reality of what the staff is dealing with to effectively review the ED? I mean, I think it's related. I think it's two things. I think that's why that's another reason why metrics matter. It shouldn't just be that person's social opinion of the executive director, but it should be based in reality. Does the organization have metrics, and is the organization achieving its metrics? And that's the objective part of reviewing the person. And then, like I said earlier, a really effective review process involves getting feedback from multiple people who see the performance from different angles, and that's a thorough review. So there's doing the review, and then there's doing a thorough review. I think a thorough review looks at the performance from several different angles.
Yeah, Alan, I think you're right, and I think the 360 idea is definitely, I've seen it more for-profit corporations than I have in the nonprofit sector. I mean, I answered the question and a little bit differently when I said that there should be some recourse for staff. Something should be reflected in a personnel policy that every staff person receives when they're hired and can refer to, but what that path would be if they have problems with the executive director or even their own direct report. But I think you're right. I recently attended a workshop where they talked about that 360 idea and where there's feedback all over the place. So I don't know how many of our organizations do that. I can find out, and whether it's been whether it's successful or not.
There's another question here about the relationship between a potential board member's financial ability and the desire to work with the board as a dedicated board member. I mean, Chris and I talked about the matrix so there's the baseline of, can the person meet the baseline requirements of being on the board. Some organizations have a give or get sort of financial question, and the person may have a lot of skills and abilities. Obviously, you need some people who are active in leading donors to be involved in the board. You may have situations where you need someone on the board who's a very whose main role is as a donor, but that's, you know, like I said, the core of your board, I think, need to be people who meet the financial obligations, are clear about the mission, and are engaged. That's the core. You may have to make some accommodations around the edges for various situations, but the core, I think, the core need to be able to meet the financial obligations, are aligned with the mission, and need to be really engaged. Chris, how would you answer that about the sort of financial question?
Yeah, it's a tough one, and it goes back to how you start the conversation with the prospect. And I agree with Alan that if the responsibilities are a financial commitment, that individual needs to meet them. The fact is, you can do a lot of things with your organization without being on the board of directors. There are other committees you can serve on. There may be ad hoc committees doing one thing or another in the community. There maybe they can be on committees. We've had people that weren't on the board serve on committees for a variety of reasons. So that may be where you want to move that individual. But I think bottom line, and going forward from this webinar, that the organization who's asked this question, I think they need to go back to the beginning and think about, you know, I want to see a handbook. I want to see roles and responsibilities clearly delineated. I mean, if you don't have that, how do you plan your budget for the year? How do you know what your gifts will be? You know, how do you know what? There are a lot of ways that you wouldn't be able to count on certain things if you didn't know this about the board member. So yeah, maybe a conversation that you're going to have. The president takes this person to coffee or lunch and has a conversation with them.
I had one other thought. There was a question about finding board members. I will say a number of for-profit corporations in the state, and BlackRock's one of them, are, you know, as they think about corporate responsibility and social responsibility, uh, are thinking about development of talent in their own organizations, and they are beginning to recognize, I'm glad to say, that serving on nonprofit boards is part of leadership development for the talent in corporations. So there, I, I think it's worth connecting to corporate people in your community around their human resources and talent departments, and finding out if organizations that are have a large office where you are looking for places to place talented individuals to learn leadership skills by serving on a nonprofit board. So,
absolutely, that's a wonderful recommendation. Also, here in Sacramento, we have something called a nonprofit board fair somehow. So people who are interested in serving on boards, you know, sort of depending on the activity of that organization, can sign up. And I would assume you would take these names, but you would still be vetting them in your in the process that you've set up in your own organization. But that's a great, you know, we hear this about Wells Fargo. They will typically give to an organization where there's representation, you know, on that board of directors. So,
right.
Very good idea.
I
don't see any other questions.
The only other one I saw is a request to see the Board of Directors handbook from ACSO, which I'm sure we're willing to share.
I am willing to share that.
Yep.
I said that loud and clear.
I think, you know, my last comment would be, you know, this is getting that committed group. There's almost anything you can do and achieve with a committed group of leaders that are on the same page. You know, it's sort of the beginning and the end is the talent that you have organized around the mission of the organization. And so finding that talent, having a view of what it needs to be for your organization so that you are ready for the future, not for the past, but ready for the future, is critical. And then it's the careful management of that group, because I will say teams stay together because they stay on the same page, because you get rid of people who are not part of the team and are not contributing, and because you're adding interesting new people to the mix. And that's what keeps it special. That's what creates a real sense of drive and passion for the team. And that's an active process. There's nothing passive about it. It's a very active process. And I think that's the heart of this. And I would say to the ACSO mission, you know, that's why we believe in peer-to-peer sharing at conference and webinars and in-person meetings, because we know that that's the way to keep the level of education and talent alive in our organizations across the state.
Well said, Alan. I would also like to say that nobody, a board member, a president, you shouldn't feel like you're out there on your own. So when you come to a board meeting, on the agenda, if you have a big issue that you need to discuss, whether it's, as an example, increasing the gift, the minimum gift of your board members, or what are some of the responsibilities that you've set forth that you want your board members to do, and if they're not, this as a discussion as a whole at a board meeting, then you vote on, the whole board's got to be in agreement of this, then that becomes your leg to stand on. That then becomes, it took us, for instance, at ACSO, it took us 2 years to do something around a financial commitment for our board members. And it wasn't a question of, I think there was a moment when we thought, well, we're just going to up the gift. Well, what difference does it make? It's not that much. We'll just up the gift. The pushback was fierce, and the discussion was much longer, and it brought into a lot of other issues than just making the gift a little bit higher. There were a lot of questions and a lot of thought and a lot of good answers that came out of it. But just the fact that the entire board made this decision, they owned it. They made the decision. So I always encourage that full board participation, led well, and then your leader's not sort of hanging out there.
Chris, as you say that, one of my favorite things is, when I talk about a small committed group, I don't mean people who are not willing to have conflict. They need to disagree. My favorite thing to say is it's they don't have to agree about everything, but a healthy board is aligned. So if they have a tough conversation and they reach a decision, they walk out of that boardroom with each other's back as if they had all made, as if it was their individual opinion. They back the agreement that they make, and they have that alignment. That's what you want.
Absolutely. See why we love this man at ACSO and why he will not serve on your board. Thank you, Alan. I don't see any other questions here, and it's after 12, and I'm going to wrap it up by telling you all that we've got a power seminar for leadership. It's on Saturday during the ACSO conference. It'll be on August 8th. It's a 4-hour session run by a partner and senior governance consultant with Loring Sternberg and Associates and Board Source. I think it's going to be a fabulous adjunct to this conversation. You all will want to be there. Bring more than one person. And then on the final screen, we've got, I think Alan has put up when the ACSO conference is. Thank you very much. And again, thank you all for your interest in this topic. Obviously, the Governance Committee is the most important committee of your Board of Directors. And Alan, wonderful job, great statistics, and thank you all so much for joining.
Hope to see you in Long Beach.
Thank you. Bye-bye.